Our next keynote presenter is Michelle Loch, and Michelle is one of Australia's leading experts in developing high performance through neuro-leadership, team engagement and brain fitness. And Michelle's topic today is understanding why people do what they do. Please welcome Michelle.
Thank you. This is a photograph of me in 1990. Yes, the hair. Perms were in. In this photograph, I was at the Gympie State High prom, and I was a teacher. So I was a high school teacher. 5 years was my career in teaching. It was my second career. The first career, I was an officer in the CBC Bank. Now that information only serves to date me and anyone else in this room who knows what the CBC Bank was. Anybody? Not many of us left. Okay. The thing about this is that I was transferred to the city and I was in the performing arts department, and an opportunity arose for me to apply for an acting role as head of department of the performing arts, and I thought that could be fun. I'll give that a go. So I threw in my CV and no one else did. So I got the job. Now the thing is, I was a great dance teacher. I was really good. And I was an amazing commerce teacher. They were my two areas. In fact, I even wrote some textbooks on commerce for high schools and I still get royalties for them. So I was pretty good. As a head of department, I was absolutely crap. Terrible. Because leading is a very, very, very different thing to teaching or whatever my other, anybody's technical expertise is. Now, 25 years or 26 years on, here I am putting myself up as a leadership expert. So you can assume that I've learned a bit between then and now, but it was an interesting journey. So I'd like to take you on a little bit of that journey today about where leadership is and what's some of the new thinking that we need to be starting to apply, and in your case, to think about the leadership in your environment and how it might be useful. Okay, so 33%, according to Gallup, is the number of people in organisations and workplaces today that are engaged, either engaged or actively engaged, which means, of course, 67% are not. 29% is the same figure but for millennials. And this is a generation that are the most educated, most privileged and most economically enabled in our history. They don't really like going to work. They're not really connected and engaged in what's going on. 14.8 billion is what stress is costing the Australian economy in our workplaces. 10.1 billion is what stress is costing our organisations directly. 63,000 plus are the number of titled books with leadership in them on Amazon, and 89,361 self-leadership books. And yet, we are still searching. We are still searching for this answer. What is it? How do we get people to do what we want them to do? How do we make our leadership better? How do we get people to be self-accountable? How do we get them to execute? We're really good at strategy, but how do we make them do things and get stuff done? And what I see when I talk to the managers I work with, they say, you know what, I've just kind of given up and it's just easier to do it myself. I've tried to get this person, I've had these conversations, we've had the meetings, I just might do it myself. And then of course they're getting stressed and they're working extra hours. So we really do need to stop this insanity. You would have seen this before. Insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We have to start doing something different. We have to start rewiring. We have to start thinking very differently, seeing a very different filter regarding the way we interact with the people in our care as leaders. But of course that's quite hard to do. Rewiring, changing the habitual ways that we work and the ways that we think is quite difficult. So we're going to have a go at that now, and I'd like you to all stand. Now, being educators, I can assume that you all know the ABC song. You know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that one? Now, can you all sing? singing, just loud singing. Now what you can see up here, of course, is the alphabet, and underneath the alphabet we have an L, an R and a B. L means left arm up. Show me. R is right and B is both. So we're going to sing the song and lift the arms at the same time. Do we get it? And we need to be loud because my singing's not that great. Are we ready? I'll count you in on 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, louder. H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. Keep singing as you sit down. Now I know my A, B, C, louder. Next time, won't you sing with me? Thank you. Congratulations. Give yourselves a clap. Okay. Was that easy to do? Was that easy to do? No. Why? Because we're not wired for it. Now, I won't do this, but if I were to get you to do that 3 or 4 times through this presentation, it would get easier. You would start to be rewiring the connections in your brain to doing that activity. But we need to remember that when we have to start doing something differently, and we're not wired for it, it's not something that we're used to, it's actually quite hard. And our brains don't like to work very hard, so we do tend to avoid and find excuses. So we'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about neuroplasticity. There are some great leaders that we can all know and reference. And what is it about them that's special? Their ability to engage. Their ability to instill a calmness all around them. And their ability for curiosity and wisdom in creating insight. You would all agree with that? That's leadership. That's what we're really talking about when we talk about leadership. And that's leadership from the heart. We do tend to be a little head-focused in our approach to leadership. So what is leadership all about? In my view, 2 things. One is managing self. How well are you self-leading? How well are the heads of department in your school, unlike me back in 1990, leading themselves? And it's about knowing how to engage and motivate others. 2 things, nice and simple. I think we still have a number of key leadership issues then around that. And the one being ego. We still want to be the experts. I find when I work in organisations that being able to default to knowing the answer and telling the answer is something that's really rewarding for us as human beings. So ego not as a bad thing, but it's something that we can hold on to and feel important about. So ego is a challenge in terms of really great leadership. Low EQ, intelligence quotient. Emotional intelligence quotient, sorry. We still haven't got there. We still don't really have an innate capacity to manage our own emotional responses and to see and manage the emotional responses of the people around us. Cognitive bias. They've now documented 300 different types of cognitive bias that we are challenged with every single day. Now, we need those cognitive bias. We need to be able to act quickly with our brain, but they get in the way. They're filters. We see the world differently through those different kind of bias, and learning about those is something we really need to start paying attention to, because it means that we're judging. It means that we're not seeing reality and not always seeing the truth. So we really need to think about that. Fixed mindset. You'll have heard the work of Carol Dweck, growth mindset. Hands up. Yeah, so yeah, I would have thought in this audience. Has been very much directed toward developing the minds of children in growth mindset. We're challenged, however, in organisations with a fixed mindset of the leaders within the organisation. So knowing that we can fail and grow and that that's a good thing. So the next being our poor relationship to risk and failure. Failure is terrible. You know, even the systems we put in place for rewarding and giving bonuses in organisations and performance reviews. It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge to people actually being authentic in their workplace. And of course, we're pretty poor communicators. Despite all of the work that we've been done, we're actually not that good at it. So we have these challenges. So I want to have a look at the way we work and why it's not working, what some of the challenges are. So the first one is the fairly obvious one of evolution. So if we think about where we came down from the trees, which is here, and where we are now in 2016, and we have, from a social perspective, evolved enormously in that time. But our brains and that evolution is still back here. And while our brain is designed to keep us alive and thrive, and we have threats out in our environment, and once upon a time we had the threats of the saber-toothed tiger, what we have now is social threats, and lots of them. The problem is that our brain responds to the social threat in the same way as it does to the physical threat. So being embarrassed, being humiliated has the same impact on our brain, the same pathways light up as if we had a gun held to our head. It's a big implication when you really think about that and how we manage that for the people around us and in our care. The World Health Organization says that stress is going to be the biggest challenge of our time. Fortune 500 companies say that creativity is going to be the biggest challenge of our time. And yet, in organisations, and certainly a lot of the ones that I work in, large organisations, the systems that we have in place to get creative are the very things that are shutting down all the creativity. Because we're not really understanding how the human brain works and responds to its environment. Who's not heard of the word VUCA, the term VUCA? A few people? VUCA is a term that was coined by the US Army 3 weeks before 9/11, so quite prophetic. And it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The concept being that the world has changed, that we're playing under new rules. And in terms of the US Army, their suggestion, of course, was that we can't play by the same rules in terms of our defence. And 3 weeks later, 9/11. I challenge anyone to say that you don't have volatility, uncertainty, or complexity or ambiguity somewhere in your life. I do at home. That's enough to start. And we've been through a number of what I call social economic shifts. So back in the day, and I call this the primitive economy, and that is when I was young. I lived in a little country town, and there was one family that owned the butcher and another one that owned the baker, and there was the Lebanese family who owned everything else. And we tended to I could walk into a shop and I could take something off the shelf and say, hey, I've got this. They'd write it down on a piece of paper. At some point, my mum would go in and pay the bill, or they'd send us a bill. So it was very high trust and very low regulation. We didn't even have credit cards. I remember when bank card came in. But then we moved into this mass economy, the Coles-Myer economy. I call it that because I remember when Coles came to town, this enormous big building. And it was a time when we suddenly had just volume of everything. I remember my mother being so excited to put away the Noritake set and get out the plastic plates because they were just new and exciting and fabulous, and we'd never seen anything like that before. And we could have dinner out of cans. Unbelievable. It was fabulous. But what happened in that time is that trust was few laughs, do you remember? Trust started to go down and regulation went up. Everything became regulated, and we know what it's like in Australia. We are so over-regulated in this country. But what's shifting now is that we're wanting to now be more connected. That natural tribal sort of desire that we have as human beings is starting to really raise its head. Think Uber. Think Airbnb. This is a bunch of people disrupting that mass economy concept. They're saying, if there is a room in New York that's not being used and somebody wants $80 for it, why would I pay $450 to a big hotel? And I also get to meet somebody and maybe get, shown around New York. It's a real change. What we're wanting and what we're verbalising now is that we want this social connection. And we need to change our leadership to align with that. Okay. So, of course, it all feels hard too. It's hard to be a leader. It's hard to manage people. All of these things I hear from my clients. And in particular, execution, getting people to actually do things and on time, and accountability. Getting people to be accountable for showing up in a way that's productive. Only yesterday, I had a very long conversation with the principal of a school up in Queensland. And she has an admin team of highly intelligent, efficient people who cannot get along with each other, and she's at her absolute wit's end. And having talked to her for some time, there's a real lack of accountability of those individuals to show up and say, actually, I'm being paid to show up as a functioning, respectful human being. And I think we need to change that mindset. And we can change that through conversations, and we can change that through education. So we have new rules, we need new tools. And what I'm suggesting is that we've really been getting the human bit wrong, that we've become amateur humans. Now that's a bit harsh, really. I don't think we've become amateur humans. I think that what's happened is that we now have a whole bunch of new science that's showing us that some of the things that we've been doing in terms of leading people is thumbs up. But some of it, maybe we haven't been getting quite right. So we're going to do a little diagnostic, and on your table there should be a handout that looks like this. So you want to grab one of those and turn to this page, the front page that says Rewire or Expire. And we're going to look at maybe what an amateur leader or an amateur human might look like, and what a professional human or leader might look like. And what I would like you to do as I go along is I'd like to give yourself a score from 1 to 10 on each of these. So if we have a look at the first one, which is an amateur operates with a full mind. Who's ever responded to the question, how are you doing with, I'm really busy? Come on. Yes. We operate with these, we have so much going on, we're multitasking, there's 10 things to do all at once, 100 things to do in a day. We need to get more mindful, we need to get more present. It's a theme that I'm sure I've heard in the last two, with the last two speakers, and that you'll hear as you go forward. So I want you to give yourself a score between 1 and 10. 10 being, I am so mindful, I don't even know what's going on because I'm so inside my mind. And 1 is, I can't even concentrate because there's so much going on in my head. So from 1 to 10, 10 being good, 1 being not so good. Can you please give yourself a score, an honest, authentic score? Is your mind too busy? And do you need to be doing something about that? Okay, so the second area to look at is this idea of telling and instructing. Who likes being told what to do? Who tells people what they need to do? We all do. We are in a tell and instruct mode. We're busy, we're time poor. We need to get things done. This is just how I need it done. But we need to be moving to an area of ask and enable. When you tell and instruct, the brain defends. We'll talk a little bit more about how and why, but I want you to think about how much telling do you do, how much instructing do you do, and how much asking and enabling do you do. The third thing is interesting versus useful. Where is the focus of the leadership in your organisation or your own? Are you easily distracted? Do your meetings go off on interesting tangents? Or are you focusing constantly on what's useful? It's a great filter to be putting over your day. Is what I'm doing right now useful? Is this emotion useful? Is this conversation useful? Is this tangent useful? And it could be. But if there's one thing that people take away from the workshops I do, it's this concept. Are we in interesting space? Or is it actually useful for the outcomes that we needed to achieve? Okay, giving yourself a score as we go along. Assumption versus curiosity. Our brains are designed to make assumptions. If we didn't make assumptions, we would take an awfully long time to do things. But we need to be more curious, because when we make assumptions, we get it wrong. We make judgments. You will have had the experience where you've gone to a meeting, come out of a meeting with a whole bunch of assumptions around what's going to happen, what it was about, and what people are going to do, to find by the next meeting or at some time in the future that those assumptions were wrong. So moving to an area of much more curiosity. When something goes wrong, the first thing that comes into your mind is, that's interesting. I should find out a bit more about that before I respond. So moving to curiosity from assumption. Where are you sitting predominantly at the moment in your busy lives? Amateur leaders rely on technical knowledge. This is the ego thing I was talking about before. We do love to be experts. It's important for us in our tribe to be respected and valued. But professionals really focus on humans and are developing their knowledge on how to work with humans. So where are you along that line? Are you where you would like to be? Or would you like to be a bit higher? And amateurs, and we see this of course in less experienced leaders, are very, very concerned about being friendly to the people that they manage. So an amateur human or an amateur leader will default to mate status as opposed to manager status. Amateur leaders, when something goes wrong, says, my team needs training. My team needs development. These kids need more of this or more of that. But a professional human will first look at themselves. What is it that I might be doing or saying that could be impacting this situation? What is it that I'm doing in the meeting or the conversation that if I changed might make a difference? That's where they go first. Where are you on that scale? And finally, amateur humans live in the reactive zone. And they're those people, I call them arsonists. They're running around organisations setting off fires everywhere with what they say. They're reacting. They're not stopping and pausing and waiting and getting curious to find out what's going on. So give yourself a score from 1 to 10 on the reactive to responsive scale. If you could then add those up, and you need to divide by 8. And yes, you can get out your phone to do that. And I'd like you to come up with a score which will be somewhere between 1 and 10. Okay, so we have a score between 1 and 10. Let's have a look at how you went. So if you had a score between 8 and 10, then you probably shouldn't be here because you're just too smart for all of us, or you're possibly delusional. If you had a score between 4 and 7, then you're probably a normal human being who has some stuff to work on. And if you had an average score of between 1 and 3, then you probably shouldn't be here, or you're also delusional. Now, tongue-in-cheek, of course, but what I'd like you to do is circle the 3 that you found that you felt were highest, and the 3 that you think are most challenging for you. And if you turn over the page, what you'll then see are the implications of these. And I've got them up on the screen as well. So if you can work on being more mindful, operating less with a full mind, you're actually going to be able to make better decisions. If you can do less telling and instructing and more asking and enabling, you're going to start to find a lot more accountability in the people that you're dealing with. If you stop getting distracted by interesting stuff and focus more on useful, that's where you get your execution. Constantly directing your conversations to the useful. If you work on assumption but you're moving more to curiosity, you're going to get a lot more objectivity in your decision making and the conversations you're having. If you can start understanding more and more on how to work with humans, that's when you're starting to get leverage in your day. It's amazing when you can start having different conversations working around the brains of the people in front of you, how that can free up your time. If you can be more of a manager than a mate, that's where you'll start to get respect. If you can think about yourself first and the changes that you can make when things aren't going right, that's when you'll start to get engagement, when people can understand you're human and you're in this as well. And of course, when you can move to be more responsive, you're going to have more self-control. And I'm talking about you, but I'm also talking about the leaders in your organisation and those who are still on their learning leadership path. So you can take away from that perhaps just some time to have reflected on how you're doing in terms of those aspects of leadership. So why neuroscience? I am an expert in this thing called neuroleadership. Neuroleadership is a term that was coined by Dr. David Loch around about 2006. And essentially what it is that we're taking the discoveries from social cognitive neuroscience and applying them to leadership. So hands up then if you have a brain. About half? About a third? Everyone, come on. Interact, that's it. We all have a brain. Keep your hands up if you know how to use it. Yeah, of course you do. We're here, we know how to use our brain. But it's a bit like a car. My dad taught me when I was young I had to learn how to, do the oil and all those bits and pieces. Sort of don't have to do that so much these days. But I can drive a car and I can sort of know that there's a noise that gives me an indication that maybe I should go and get something looked at. But at the end of the day, if my car breaks down, I don't really know how to fix it. And our brains are a little bit like that. I mean, we grew up, didn't we, not knowing very much at all about how this thing works. And yet it's the very thing that drives every aspect of our success in life. So it's really important for us to know a little bit more about it. I notice a lot of you are wearing black. A lot of us have black in our wardrobes. Why black? Why black, ladies? Makes us look thinner, so they say. What else? What else is it about black? Goes with everything, doesn't it? It doesn't date. It actually makes us look quite sophisticated. Well, neuroscience is the new black. And it's something that you should be wearing. And you do start to hear it, don't you? There's neuromarketing, there's neuro this and neuro that. But we have learnt so much about neuroscience in recent times that it is something that you need to pay attention to. So let's have a look. We've learned more in the last 20 years about the human brain than in all of the history before. Most of the neuroscientists that have ever lived are alive today. 20 of the last 25 years of Nobel Prizes have gone to neuroscientists, and President Obama, not for much longer, is on board. In 2013, he committed $10 billion to a project to map the human brain, with the concept that we still don't know enough. We still need to know so much more about why people do what they do if we're going to manage the social challenges that are ahead of us. The big discoveries. You would have heard of the term neuroplasticity. Yeah? Our brains are plastic. Goodness. Our brains are plastic. So we used to think that by the time we got to 18, we had what we had. Now we know that our brain is changing literally as we're sitting here, right till the day that we pass. And we do have a lot of control over how that can happen. We have an executive brain function, this part of the brain at the front, which is our intelligent brain. But what we're learning about it more and more is actually how dumb it is. So we have an issue there. And if you do come to my breakout, we'll go a little bit more into that when we're going to map your brain and have a look at some things there about the prefrontal cortex. We've discovered things called mirror neurons that also sit in that prefrontal cortex, our capacity for empathy and how they can help us to understand others. The problem is that when our prefrontal cortex is challenged, which is where they live, we have very little capacity for empathy. So managing the prefrontal cortex, and that's what brain training is all about, has so many knock-on effects in terms of our capacity to actually connect with others in our environment. Social brain and social pain, we have discovered that the same networks that light up when we experience pain of a physical kind light up when we experience social pain. There was a case study and an experiment called the Tylenol experiment in the States, so the equivalent of aspirin or Panadol. And essentially, taking Panadol or aspirin can reduce the feelings of humiliation and rejection in the same way that they can reduce physical pain. Not that I'm suggesting we should do that on a regular basis, but it's the same networks. And again, that has huge implications for us as leaders. The one that excites me the most is what we're learning about insight and learning. We can create, we know the 4 things that need to be in play for individuals to be having insights, to give us a better opportunity to do that, and we can create that artificially in our conversations. So Dr. Rock says, teaching people about their brain has a profound effect on their ability to understand themselves and understand others, making them far more effective at whatever they do. And if you do want to know more about this, go and Google the Neuro Leadership Institute. There's an enormous amount of information there. David was my trainer, and I worked for David for a number of years, so I was very lucky to be at the beginning of this whole movement and process. But it's amazing, when I do teach people about this in organisations, they'll often say, I knew all this stuff, but now I know why. And it seems to be driving behaviour in a way that we haven't seen before. So in terms of humans, this is what we tend to do. We react, and we can't stop that. An event occurs, we react. It's what we do after that that matters. So for those of us who are relatively inexperienced, we will tend to repeat responses or behaviours. Or if we're really tired and exhausted or busy, we'll also repeat past behaviours, things that have so-called worked for us before. Or we might be a little bit more evolved and we might go to a response, a choice. We might say, I can see that this has happened, so I'm now going to choose to do this, or I'll choose to do this. And we feel quite good about that we're having a really, considered response to the situation, but it's still all about us. What we want to do here is start giving a whole new set of filters and tools to go to a level of experimentation, so that ultimately what we can do is get better at diagnosing the behaviour in front of us so that we can prescribe much better responses. And this sort of applies to kids as well. I have a 14-year-old and I have a 12-year-old. Not having a lot of success with the 12-year-old yet, but the 14-year-old, I'm starting to use these concepts for her to understand what's going on for her and the choices and the curiosity that she needs to have around that so that she can prescribe better responses to the challenges she has in her life. So when we react and we allow that reaction to occur, we get shut down in our own brain, but we shut down other people, don't we? If we go into repeat, it's a bit of apathy, so we can predict that when such and such happens, the boss is going to do that. It's the same thing over and over again. It's not taking anything into account. When we respond, that's a safe place, and we've done good, and that's okay. But when we experiment, we start to have a lot more options. And this is that cycle that we need to break in terms of, I don't know what else to do with this person. But we need to get into a place where we have more information, more tools, so that we can start to experiment, so that we can diagnose. Because when we diagnose, then we can have influence. So let's now start to have a look at some of these concepts that might be useful. We know that people aren't predictable. We know they don't like being told what to do. We know that one size doesn't fit all. We know now how easily we can set people off just with a word or a tone or even just inside being upset, the impact that can have through mirror neurons. We know that when people get it, things really pop. We need leadership mastery. And this is really where my focus is these days, is how do we get that icing on the cake now in terms of leadership? And there are 5 levels. For me, the first is mastery in human motivation, which is what I've been talking about. And if we can achieve that, we've got that place of a sort of diagnosis, being able to prescribe really great next steps or outcomes or responses to situations. That's where we're going to start to really work on engagement. We need to be masters of self-leadership, so that we can have better decisions, and that's where we're going to get improvement on performance. We need to be masters of execution. We need to know what happens, the way the brain works over the period of a day. You only have about 2 hours of really good quality intelligent thinking in your brain over a day, 2 hours. And how you work your activities around that has enormous impact on the performance that you have and the productivity that you have. We need to be much more powerful communicators. We need to look at brain-based approaches to having conversations so that we can influence. And thought leadership, the icing on the cake, the respect that you get as a leader comes from how you can articulate your thinking around leadership, around your expertise, in a way that applies and appeals to all of the brains in the room in front of you. We're on a journey from technician, where I was as a teacher, through to master leader, which is where you get your return on investment as you develop these master mentors in your organisation. And we want to go from a place of reacting through to inspiring. All right. So for the next half an hour, what I'd like to do is go through each of those areas and give you some tips and maybe a little bit of science around each of those areas. So let's start with the human motivation piece. So this comes from the work of Dr. Evian Gordon. Now I want you to imagine that the brain operates on a continuum from a place of threat to reward. And you may have heard some of this, the limbic state and the logic state. Now why have I written threat in a much bigger font? Anybody? We run towards threat. Our brain will take notice 5 times more of a threat, be that a social threat or a physical threat, than it will to reward. Okay? Now when we're in threat state, these are the sort of emotions that we can expect to experience. We've got anger, anxiety, frustration, fear, but it's what we do that makes the difference here. When we're in that state, we tend to react, we tend to defend. It wasn't my fault, blaming. We generalise. Every stick is a snake. We have a very narrow focus. It's very difficult for us to see options and opportunities when we're in threat state. We push back, we can't communicate well, and we become really pessimistic. And what's happening is that we have stress hormones pumping around our body. So this is our fight-flight centre. It's gone off. So we have this in our central nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic goes out in sympathy. Something happens, it responds, and all of the body jumps into that sort of fight-flight mode, ready to fight. So all of the oxygen and glucose from our brain that functions for our brain starts getting into the rest of our body, so we're ready to run and fight. Our brain shuts down, our digestive system shuts down. It's not good. The idea then is that when the threat goes away, that the parasympathetic system will jump back in. But what happens is often the threat doesn't go away. If we haven't managed that well, and people are continuously moving on this state of threat, and it doesn't take much, remember, 5 times more sensitive, then we're in this state of limbic. What happens then is that we can only focus on the problem. At the other end of the scale, we have the reward state. Happy, all of those alternate emotions, joy, happiness, engagement, curiosity, optimism, and we have much more capacity in that moment. So of course what we want is our students and ourselves and our teachers to be in a reward state. We have happy hormones. You've heard of dopamine, I'm sure? Dopamine hits. We love our dopamine hits. Being in that reward state is very desirable for us. We see more options, we're motivated, we can solve problems. And that is where we're going to start to be in solution mode. Overwhelm sits in the limbic side or the threat side, and motivation sits on the reward side. So that's all fine. You may have even heard a lot of that. The thing is, what is it that triggers us? What is it that sends us one way or the other up and down this continuum? So I'm going to give you a model that is sort of based on, I guess, Dr. Rock's SCARF model, if any of you have seen this. But we've added a little bit into it. So it's the Inspire model. And these are the triggers, the things that send us one way or the other up and down the continuum. So the E in Inspire means being present. So the very overriding issue here is that if you're not present, if you're not mindful, if you're not actually watching out and paying attention to what's going on in the human in front of you, then none of this really matters. But there are 5 things that trigger us, and it's great because it's like a checklist. It's a checklist you can use when you go into a conversation. It's a checklist when you're in a meeting and it's going off track and it's not useful the way it needs to be. The first is S, status. Now, status is not about feeling important. Status is about feeling valued and respected. And we're so easily triggered if we're not getting that sense of status. If we feel like we have a low level of status, we're down the threat end. But if we feel important, then our status is very high and we're more up the reward end of the brain state, in that good space. Now, the thing about status is that the part of the brain that processes status is the same part that processes maths. So it's like a number. Every 3 seconds, your brain is scanning this room and figuring out where you sit in, I don't know, 300 people. Now, at the moment, I can pretty much say I'm close to being number 1. I'm up here or looking at me, maybe laughing at some jokes. I can assume that I'm doing all right in this room. But if I were to fall off the stage, or if I were to tell a joke that went down really, really badly, my status would go down. Status is something, though, that we can build up very easily. And of course, it's all the stuff that we do with kids. We just don't always do it so much with our colleagues. So status is something that can throw us one way up and down the continuum. The second is predictability. We love certainty. We have the capacity, and we need the capacity to predict. And if we can't predict what's going to happen, we go into threat state. Make sense? So the more certainty that you can put in your processes, in your interactions, the more you're going to have people in that reward state in your team. The I is about independence, and this is about autonomy, about choice. People need to have some sense of control over their environment. So every opportunity you have, you need to give people choices, even if it's a choice within a closed space. So we can't do this, that's the certainty, but within that can't, we have 3 cans, and 3 is always better than 2. You could do this, or you can do this, or you can do this. So any opportunity you have to give choice is an advantage in getting people into a brain state where they have much more cognitive capacity. The fourth R is relatedness. Now this is sort of about relationships, but it's a slightly different take. Relatedness is around friend or foe. How am I relating to you? How are your people relating to you as a leader? Are you on their side or not on their side? And of course this changes all the time, doesn't it? But knowing where they are at any point in time can give you the clue to diagnose why you may not be getting through. Are they relating to me at this point in time as a foe, not a friend? And the final is equity, fairness. A big trigger for many people. And it's all perception. Everything I'm talking about here is perception. If their perception is of low status, if their perception is that they can't predict, if their perception is that they have no control or choice, that you are on the opposite side of the table, and that this is not fair, then there will be a threat state created in their brain. And this goes right through from children to adults. So in terms of understanding human motivation, what we know is that we've got this continuum between threat and reward. We want them to be in reward, and there are 5 things that we can start to check off to give us an indication of when the person in front of us is shutting down. Does that make sense? So what's great about this is that when something is going wrong, there is the checklist, and you can start to ask questions around it. So you're noticing some response that's not quite what you want. And you think, I think it's because they're not certain. They're not predicting what's going on here. So you can say, is there something you're not certain about? I notice that you seem a little anxious about this. It just gives you a guide. And when you're going into a very difficult conversation, you can do an Inspire checklist before you go in. I need to be really present here. How do I make sure they feel valued and respected? How do I make sure they have some choice in this situation? So it's a great model for us to use in terms of human motivation. What I'd like you to do is think about, of those 5, which one are you most triggered by and which one are you least triggered by? And I'd like you just to write them down. So whether it be status, whether it be predictability, independence, relatedness, or equity. Now, we all get triggered by all of these, but some of us more than others on certain ones. I know for myself, equity is a really big trigger. If there's something unfair, I'm in there. I'm fighting away. So if you've written that down, now I want you to think about that. The one that triggers you the least is the one that you may trigger most in others. Right? The one that you think about least as a trigger, because you're not paying attention, is potentially, for someone who might be triggered highly in that, the thing you trigger in others. And can you imagine some of these triggers, as I'm talking, going on in your organisation? You can see things happening. So when you start to put labels to these things and diagnose what's going on, it really gives you another sense of power, another sense of mastery in terms of having to deal with what's going on with the humans in your care. All right. So let's move on to then a mastery in self-leadership. And this is such an important aspect of leadership mastery, the capacity for you to lead yourself. You are fully responsible for the energy that you bring into a space. But what I'm really on about at the moment is that we need to make sure that the people that we employ feel that same sense of responsibility. You're paying people to come to work to be fully functioning human beings. Now, we're prepared to help, we're prepared to support, we're prepared to facilitate them getting better at that. But I think we need to make sure that the mindset is that they have that responsibility to bring that themselves. Because what I'm finding is that when I'm working with individuals in organisations, they don't even want that. It's everyone else's problem. So self-leadership is a big thing. I'm doing work at the moment at the Mater Hospital in Queensland. 7,000 staff. We're going to teach 7,000 staff how to have better conversations. But we're also running a stream of self-leadership, so that everyone in the organisation is getting the capacity to be a better leader and starting with themselves. So, leadership's all about emotions. I love that picture. It is all about emotions. It's about how we control that very basic part of our brain that is there for, for our survival. So, Antonio Damasio, we are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think. And I think we underestimate, perhaps not this audience so much, but we underestimate the role that emotions play. Emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman was very popular for a while, went off the boil. It's kind of come back on now, but with a scientific basis, not a scientific basis, but a scientific flavour behind it. The ability to perceive, control and evaluate emotions, turning impulses and emotions into reasoned actions, that emotional mastery. So there is a direct correlation between engagement and EQ. Leaders who score 75 plus on the EQ score have almost 100% of the people in their care saying that they are engaged or actively engaged. When that 75% comes down to about 50, it's about 60%. So there's a big difference. There's an absolute direct correlation. So your capacity to see the emotions, but more importantly to manage your own emotions in the workplace is very important. When I talked before about the mirror neurons in our prefrontal cortex. When you experience a reaction or an emotion and it's not controlled, even if it's not, in your view, visible to the outside, it only takes 8 milliseconds for that emotion to be caught by the people around you, even if it's inside you. All right? The mirror neurons are incredible at picking up on those things. But what really is engagement? Engagement is when people feel they matter and what they do matters. And it is a gift. It's a gift that people give you in your organisation. So you need to be working hard on that emotional intelligence, that self-leadership, which relates directly to the engagement. Emotions are contagious. The mirror neurons will pick up on every emotion that you have. So the things you need to be careful of are, firstly, not that your emotions are contagious to others, that's part of the thing, but you need to be careful that you don't catch other people's emotions. There's always going to be a battle. And the person who will win that emotional contagious battle will be the person who holds out the longest, who actually is aware of what's going on. You walk into a room, everyone's exhausted, you're either going to come down or you're going to bring them up. So it is your role in terms of self-leadership to recognise that and to make sure that you are the person winning that battle. You need to notice your own emotions, you need to regulate your emotions, and you need to refocus the attention and the energy. So we use a traffic light system. It's the 8 milliseconds it takes to get the emotion there. Oh, sorry, the power of breathing. So there is a breathing app. Scientists have discovered that every individual has a unique breathing rate. So we talked before about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. When you breathe at your exact individual rate that works for your sympathetic system, the limbic system will start to calm down. Now you can get this app, it's called My Calm Beat. You can get an attachment that will actually help you determine what your natural breath is. If not, they give you an advance, some advice of where to go at the middle range. But essentially when at rate, it brings everything back into play. It brings us back into what's called homeostasis. And it's very important that when you are rushed, the first thing that you do is breathe out. So we all tend to think I'm going to breathe and we go in, and all that does is bring all the energy in. What we want is actually to breathe out first. So I want you to just do it with me a few times and start with breathing out, not in, so go out first. and then breathe in, and then out. So always start with out. It's a little thing, makes a lot of difference, but it brings us back to this state of homeostasis, brings our nervous system back into play. If you do that just 10 minutes a day, and it doesn't have to be 10 minutes at once, 2 minutes at a time, the effect lasts for 24 hours. If you do that 3 times a week, the effect, the cumulative effect of that can be up to weeks. Okay. So what we want to do is 3 things. In terms of this self-leadership, we want to acknowledge, we want to label, and we want to then reframe. So whenever we get that emotional reaction, the first thing we need to do is validate it. And particularly if you're working with someone else in front of you, so you need to acknowledge your own emotions, but acknowledging their emotion is incredibly powerful. You know what it's like when you're sitting in a meeting and someone's sitting in the corner and you know that they're upset but no one says anything. Validating and acknowledging that emotion will allow the limbic system to start to let go of it. And if we can get people to label emotions, and you label your emotion accurately, the limbic system will start to let go of that emotion. So what we know is that an accurate label makes a difference. We think it's because in order to bring that labelling into play, we've got to bring in this prefrontal cortex, and the two can't work at the same time. So we're forcing all the metabolic resources in our brain to come into this language space, this intelligence space, and therefore it can't hold on to that emotion. So simply labelling makes an enormous difference in the way we manage emotion. But then the key is on reframing. Where are we then directing our attention to somewhere useful? It is not useful to be focusing on the problem. It is not useful to be focusing on the negative emotions. It is useful to be then deciding where we're going next. So what is the next step? What is the next thing we have to do? So we need to stop and acknowledge and validate what's going on. We need to label what's going on, but then we need to redirect the attention so that we start going somewhere new and building new connections in our brain. And what we're doing, of course, in doing that is moving people from the threat state over to the reward state, into a much more cognitive, functioning mental space. All right. I'd like you to stop just for a minute and just to get a little bit more energy in. Can you stand up? And I'd like you just to turn to the person beside you and tell them the one thing that you've found most useful so far. One thing. The most useful thing that you'll hear today. We're going to look now at productivity. We have this thing, and I've referred to it a couple of times now, called the prefrontal cortex. I want you to turn to the person beside you and point to their forehead. And I want you to say, inside your forehead is an evolutionary masterpiece. And shake their hand, congratulate them. So we have this thing called the prefrontal cortex, but it's really very fickle. It is the thing that separates us from animals. It is the thing that makes us intelligent. And as I said, in my workshop later, we'll go a lot more into just how fickle it is. But we think it's so amazing. The thing is that it fills up. Our brain runs on this fuel of glucose and oxygen. We fill that up every day and at various times during the day. We refuel through nutrition, through water. The brain is 80% water, and good exercise and sleep. But the brain uses that fuel at different rates depending on the different activities that you're doing. And anything that you do with the prefrontal cortex drains the brain enormously. So our brain is 2% of our body mass but uses 20% of its energy. And the PFC uses 95% of the 20% when it runs. Which is why we sort of only have these 2 hours of really productive time in a day. So we do need to be careful about the activities that we do and draining our brain. One of the biggest drains, of course, is email. Because we have to do all of those intelligent sort of functions. And what's the first thing that we do every day when we get into work? Check our email. So we need to start really thinking in terms of execution, right? We're getting mastery over execution, how we're spending our brain fuel. What it means is that as human beings, we're really easily overwhelmed. It means we can only really do one thing at a time. The prefrontal cortex, when I started in this work in 2006, the researchers were saying we could hold 11 concepts in our prefrontal at any one time and manipulate them. Then 7, then 4, now 1. So the minute we start holding and manipulating more than one complex idea in our brain without, having someone else to help us or write it down or stick it on a whiteboard, we start to lose performance. That's a huge implication for the way that we work today, particularly with all the distractions we have with technology. What we need to do is not that. Who multitasks? Who has probably applied for a job at some point that said multitasking is a necessity on the job description? Multitasking is the one thing that we really have to start looking at in terms of execution. It's just not good for our brain. 1 in 8, do you know what that number represents? The number of people in Australia who use marijuana. That means there's one of you at every table. Would you put your hands up, please? Saying that you do. When people use marijuana, you get a drop in IQ points of around 5. When you do an all-nighter or a lack of sleep, and who's not ever been there before, you get a drop of about 10 IQ points. So you're actually better than smoking marijuana than doing an all-nighter. The way the brain processes information when we multitask is switching. It's like a computer. It doesn't actually do 2 things at once. It's switching between the 2, and it's very costly from a cognitive perspective. Now, the picture on the left is actually the way men tend to process. Right? So 2 halves of the brain don't actually join. They're joined by a thing called the corpus callosum, which is a number of sort of communication channels that goes between the 2. And so when we switch, we're going back and forward. And you can see that men have a tendency not to do so much of that or not so easily. Women, on the other hand, do a lot of this. We're all over the place. The thing is that when women multitask, they lose around 5 IQ points. When men multitask, they lose 15. So guys, you're much better off smoking a joint and staying up late than trying to do the budget and call your wife at the same time or your husband. Yes! It's true, and the reason is that because women have a lot more of those connections. So we have the capacity to actually go back and forth. Now, I'm sorry to say, ladies, we don't multitask any better. All right? There's no difference in terms of performance. But in terms of kind of the drop of the IQ and the capacity to do that, it's much more cognitively costly for men. Now, of course, the upside for men is that they have much more capacity to make very clear decisions and think logically and compartmentalise, whereas we're here, there, everywhere, can't make a decision. And there are all sorts of benefits, on both sides. But interesting. Heavy multitaskers are actually worse at it. The more you multitask, you actually get physical changes in your brain. And where we see those changes is in the temporal lobes here, well, actually not temporal lobes, on the side of the prefrontal cortex. And we start to impair the capacity for emotional control. So our ability to inhibit reacting and inhibit emotional responses is compromised through multitasking. It's not good. We get this cognitive change. It's harder to make decisions because we're so used to being all over the shop, we're looking for more options all the time. Right? So the more you multitask, the harder it is to make decisions. Much less creative because we tend to be doers, not thinkers. Hard to focus. And we do have this tendency, heavy multitaskers don't think and feel, they just do. So it's a real issue. And yet we see it all the time, don't we? And all of the tests about, driving and texting and can women do it better, women generally do it worse. Not me. All those other women. When you multitask in a meeting, it's more than your IQ that's a challenge, it's your EQ. The fact that you're prepared to do that and disrespect the people in the room shows that you have a lesser social, cognition and control. And you're losing about those 10 points. Distraction. When we start to give in to distractions, like all of the dings on the computer, we start to compromise our productivity by up to 40%. And when you get distracted and you're in something, when you're trying to do a project and you're in the middle of something and you get distracted for that moment, it can take up to 15 minutes for your brain to get back down into that space. When we start to look at the mastery of execution, it's about the waves and cycles of our brain and what the impact of our distractions are. So it's a big issue. But of course, we're addicted to the dopamine hit. Oh, someone's liked my page. I got a notification. I have to see it. I have to see it. Even if the result of seeing it wasn't what I wanted, it doesn't matter. Someone wanted me. And we want that dopamine hit. It makes us feel good. It puts us into that reward state. So we have a challenge, but then we get addicted. So some of the tips. Thinking about power hours. And we say this, but do we actually do it? Are you prepared to turn your phone off? Are you prepared to turn the notifications off? Are you prepared to shut the door and say, don't come in? I'm hearing some yeses, good. 20-minute sprints. For the really heavy stuff, that's about all you can handle. Your brain does need brain breaks. It needs to stop and it needs to regenerate that fuel because you're using it on anything that's intensive. Who hates running? Good news, walking is much better for your brain than running. So oxygen, when you run, the oxygen is going to your muscles. When you walk, there's more chance of the oxygen going to your brain. It's my excuse anyway. One thing at a time, as I said before, and checking your email on a schedule, so 3 times a day, turning off the notifications, having an out of office. I check my emails at 11. Anything else that's urgent, please call me. Whatever you need to do. But this execution piece, getting mastery over that so that we can actually be more productive in our day is something that we need to focus on. Okay, so we're up to level 4. This is my favourite, mastering powerful communication. I believe that we can change cultures through conversations, better conversations. I believe that cultures are your conversation. But I believe from everything I see that we're still not very good at it. And I know lots of people who've done coaching courses, and I'm a coach, I'm a qualified coach, but we still don't really quite get it right. We still haven't got that absolute mastery over it. And I think that if we can achieve that, we can make an enormous difference in the way we're interacting as human beings. 80% of our day is spent in conversation. 80%. 37% on average an employee spends in meetings. That's an amazing opportunity for leverage, and an amazing opportunity for quality thinking, for insights, for creativity. And we're just not utilising it. We're having meetings just to share information. I did this week, I did this week, I did this week. Great. Right? That's what I see in meetings. And we don't have debate. We're not having conflict because we're too scared. We're avoiding the conversations we need to be having. We're going around in circles, doing the same thing over and over again. There's way too much telling. Judith Glaser, Conversational Intelligence, if you've read her work, her research shows that 95% of the interactions in a workplace are telling and instructional. What you're doing when you tell somebody something is depriving them of their dopamine hit. That's not fair. You get it. You get it. Oh, this is what you do. I'm so great. But they're not getting it. They're not having that motivation. They're not getting into the reward state. And of course, if you're doing all the telling, you're doing all the thinking. And as a leader, you haven't got time for that. We're avoiding the tough conversations because we don't have the confidence and the courage to have them because we don't have the skill. And my aim when I teach in this area is that you should be able to go into any conversation completely unafraid, because you know that whatever happens, you can manage, whatever happens. That there's not a structure, oh, they didn't go to plan, they're supposed to say this so that I can say that. We need to be teaching the motivation, the brain-based approach, which kind of says, well, if that's what's in front of me, let me diagnose what's going on, what are my options, what can I now do, what are some of the strategies that I have. We need to give people, throughout all of our organisations, and this is what we're doing at the MARTA, 7,000 people we're training at different levels in better conversations, so that they can have the conversations they need to be having. We're multitasking, and we are finding it, as I said before, just easier to do it myself. And that puts all the pressure on the leader. And we know now just how easily we can set off those threat responses in individuals. And if we don't get it right in a conversation, and we set off that threat, and we don't know how to handle then the fact that we've set off the threat, that becomes a problem. And we avoid the conversations in the future. So what we want is to get off this treadmill of conversations and onto the elevator. So at the bottom of the elevator, we have our tell conversations. I call them ignorant conversations, because generally they're people who are just simply unaware that by just telling people what to do is not the best thing in terms of motivation and moving people to action, because you will get resistance. And if you tell someone what to do and it doesn't work, whose fault is it? Much better to help them figure out what they need to do, and they can grow and learn and try. Next up the ladder, we have informative conversations where we're sharing. They're those meetings, as I said, and said, what did you do this week, Joe? What did this do this week? John, Jill, Jenny? And they're great for creating awareness. And sometimes that's what you need. But you need to be cognizant in the moment. Are you achieving what you need to in that conversation? Is it useful? And if you're just sharing information, I would challenge whether you need to have the meeting at all. Then we go into investigative conversations when we're asking, but generally we're asking for understanding and our own understanding. Again, this is useful, but it's not necessarily going to take us, in gigantic leaps in terms of execution and accountability and creativity. We want to be in the green space up the top. We want to be in influential conversations where we're really connecting with people and engaging them and them engaging us. Or we want to be ultimately in those insightful conversations where we're asking the questions that create insight in the other person, that give them the dopamine hit so that they want to do something, so that they're motivated to act. You can change the chemical makeup of your brain and other people's brains when you understand how to ask the right questions and how to focus on the right things. So my definition of a powerful conversation is that where everyone in the conversation or the meeting walks away with different thinking to when they came. We're looking for different thinking, quality thinking. It's all about the thinking. Different thinking, different outcomes. Who has children? Who likes them? Do you like them better than other people's? Ideas are the same, right? We like our own ideas better than others, and we know a lot now about the science of insight. There are 4 things that are required in the brain for an insight to occur. The first is that we need to be slightly happy. So in terms of environment, this is all the stuff around we need to like our boss. We need to be in that reward state. We need to not feel threatened in any way. We've got to be in that slightly happy state for any kind of creativity or insight to occur. We need to have a quiet brain. We need that time and that silence, that time to reflect. We also need to be inwardly looking. And this is about asking questions that force people to reflect. So when you're having conversations and you're asking questions and people are just flicking back the answers to you, you're not in the right space. All you're doing is getting them to regurgitate stuff they already know. We want different thinking. You want to be asking questions where they have to go and reflect. Now, what happens when you do that? When you ask one of those questions and people stop and think, what happens to their eyes? Yeah, they go up, left or right. There's a whole theory around lying and not lying. But they go up because all of the data that's coming into the brain is too much. They can't actually go in and find the answer. So you know you're in the right space when their eyes go up. So we need to be in that reflective space. But the catch is we need to be not thinking about the problem. So you've all experienced a big aha moment. Where do you have your aha moments? walking the dog, getting the shower, getting the coffee. Not when you're trying to think. The PFC actually gets in the way of creativity. The intelligent part of our brain gets in the way of having insight and creativity. So there's a whole series of questioning techniques that we now have to help us get into a place where we can create more insight in our students and in our teachers. Okay. So I'm just going to move forward here. Conversations influence the wiring in our brain. Where you direct attention will direct attention to the right wiring in the brain and will grow it. And conversations ultimately are your culture. So knowing through deliberate neuroplasticity, through the fact that you can direct attention in the brain and change people's brains gives you an incredible influence over the behaviours and the thinking of the people around you in your care as a leader. So developing leadership in conversation, mastery, would be worth your while. Deb Cox is a principal of a school up in Queensland. She did one of the Rewired conversations programs that I run, and this was her response. This program enabled me to make sense of much of my prior learning around leadership, coaching and self-management, builds a sophisticated layer of knowledge and skills on my foundation. What she said was it just started to bring everything together, because there's a lot of PD that's been done in these areas, but when you get the science underneath it, it seems to bring it together, seems to give you the why and make sense. So I want to finish off on mastery and thought leadership, and this is the icing on the cake. And if you think about the leadership teams in your organisation, this is ultimately where you want to be taking them. Mastery and thought leadership. Do they think for themselves? They've done lots of courses, but can they actually stand up and with gravitas in a presentation provide their thinking on leadership? Graduates of my course have to stand up on a whiteboard and present their philosophy on leadership. What do they think about this? You know, have we gone to that extra layer of icing on the cake? We need to understand what our unique intelligence is. Not just how many hours we've studied at university or the things that we've studied at university, but what are we individually good at leaders? So understanding your unique intelligence, where your brain wiring is harder, is a huge asset in understanding who you are as a leader. Your leadership philosophy, as I said, presenting with gravitas, telling stories that inspire and influence are a great way to develop your leadership capacity. And you need to be able to communicate with all brain types in mind. You need to be able to take an idea and flesh it out so that it's left brain, right brain, forward brain, back brain, all of those things, so that you're going to get the most landing of the message with wherever you're communicating. That's where you'll get respect. So in terms of the education sector, Gallup have produced a study, which is sort of obvious, I guess, but it's proven the link between the leadership of a principal and leadership of heads of departments right through to student achievement. So it's important. It's very important to develop mastery in this leadership skill. In terms of the US, they're starting to now collect data and big data about the emotional experience in higher education, not just the academic and intellectual outcomes. Linking so much more that personal engagement and experience to the value of the education that's being provided. And in terms of high school students, I have a 14-year-old and I'm trying to already start to get her to be like a master human, to master her own self-leadership. You know, imagine if we could explain to students the value of taking even a 6-minute nap between when they've learned something and when they need to go into the exam. The cramming right up to the end actually doesn't work for the human brain. There's so much that we could start to educate them about in little bits, you know, just from about grade 10, 11. I would love to see that starting to come in. So I'm going to leave you with a video.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. See, it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
You don't have to really be the lone nut, but there is a bit of a movement happening around this whole focus back on the humans thing. And we do have neuroscience at the moment with a lot of discoveries occurring that are really helping us to get our heads around that. So if this is something that you're interested in, maybe it's something that you want to pursue to start a movement around. I wish you the best. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your conference.